the Norman period, beginning in 1066, and this is also the start of the Middle Ages, running up until around the 1150s when you get to Henry II. The context into this period is that it's a huge turning point in law and order. William of Normandy gained control of England by force after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. What this means is he's a foreigner who's taken over the country by force, and therefore he is challenged by a rebellious Anglo-Saxon population who resent being controlled by a foreigner, England effectively being run as a colony at this time. William, therefore, wants to establish his authority quickly in order to gain control, so all the decisions you're about to make are informed by that context. This leads to brutal punishment, and he wants to encourage Norman colonisation of England, but they're outnumbered 300 to 1. Therefore, he needs to introduce laws to protect the Normans coming across to England, but also establish his control over the people he's just conquered. What this leads to is brutality. William the Conqueror was the king over the strict feudal system, the land system, establishing a strict social hierarchy with the Normans on top, slowly removing the Anglo-Saxon culture, Normanizing the country. What this means is these brutal punishments means we see the end of botgeld and wehrgeld, because no longer are we bothered about compensation payments to victims from perpetrators. We simply just want to deter all restlessness. Therefore, the way to do this is increases in capital punishments. We are just going to deter crime through brutal, harsh punishments, instill fear into the population. In addition to that, we're also going to use the pillory and stocks to humiliate. Public could vent their own anger with rotten vegetables, swearing, spitting, etc. on people in the stocks. What you see during the reign of William I is this idea of a singular, tough king. England is his mund, and therefore it's his domain, his domain. The king's power therefore increases during the reign of William I. Norman fears, the fears of the Normans inside England inspire two new laws. The first one is the killing a Norman law. As mentioned earlier, Normans are outnumbered 300 to 1. So punishment for killing a Norman was made deliberately severe. What I mean by this is, if there's 300 Anglo-Saxons to every one Norman, the Normans are in a vulnerable position. Therefore, they need to make it a harsh punishment if they are the victim of a crime. This is a clear demonstration of the hierarchy, Normans deemed as being more important than the Anglo-Saxons. The punishment for killing a Norman was the murderum fine, murderum being Latin for secret killing. If the killer of a Norman could not be brought to justice, then the rest of the 100 would be forced to pay a huge crippling fine to the king. What's important here is where this is different to the botgeld and the wehrgeld. Botgeld and wehrgeld, which are finished now, they were compensation payments to the victim. The murderum fine is a payment to the crown, to the king. We also see the introduction of forest laws. William believed that all of England was his royal domain. Therefore, he can do whatever he wanted it because he conquered it. The forest laws, therefore, extend William's control into rural and or lawless areas. He declared that 30% of the land would be protected as royal forest, forest just meaning outside, it doesn't literally mean forest. This made hunting in these areas illegal and forces peasants off the land. Now, obviously, in order to enforce these laws against poaching and hunting and taking the crops from that land, William installed sheriffs into these areas to enforce the laws. This means that the sheriffs were William's eyes and ears, and the key thing is this extends William's control into rural areas, areas that previously may not have had a representative of the king. William now has a sheriff in those areas. The punishment for breaking the forest laws were extreme fines and even death for multiple offenders. King's officials governed the land. Punishments included heavy fines, blinding, mutilation, and death for repeat offenders. The problem is, some people need to eat. Well, people need to eat in order to survive. So this leads to the social crime of punishing later on. People simply need the resources of the land, and therefore resources on the land, and therefore repeatedly break the law and trespass to gather resources. These people were not seen as criminals by the community, as the crime only affected the rich and was only done in order to survive. What we also see during the reign of William is increased church independence. Because William's such a powerful king, he was willing to give the church more independence. He's also keen, as he's such a pious ruler, he's also keen for the Norman church, now in England, to catch up with reforms which have gone across the rest of Europe. Therefore, as part of Lanfranc's reforms, churches were independent from state and law. Church power over law increased. Church courts would try members of the clergy, those accused of heresy and moral crimes such as sex outside of marriage. So the church now has its own separate court. This obviously brings with it problems. For example, church courts and the benefit of clergy. Church courts were more lenient as the church doesn't believe in the death penalty and only deal with clergy. So people faked being members of the church to prevent getting the death penalty. People would pretend they were priests and memorize what was called the neck verse, as in to save your neck from the noose, to prevent hanging and prove they were priests. This worked because society was illiterate and the Bible was in Latin. The church also offered sanctuary. A criminal, if you had committed a crime, you could run to the church and hide there for 40 days to escape arrest. After this, you had to give yourself up, and if you confessed, you could leave the country, as in be exiled. You had to go to the nearest port and leave the country. Or if you refused to confess, you were branded outlaws and were no longer protected by the law. We do see some things remain the same during the Norman period. For example, in terms of policing and trials, we still have no police force. Catching criminals is still based on the local community, the hue and cry and the tithing. Still no police force. Follow the same customs, and this shows continuity, as in stays the same within community policing. We have a small change in trials by ordeal. They add trial by combat. The purpose of this is to reflect the Norman warrior culture and their culture of chivalry. This shows the importance of warfare within the Norman society. And once again, the common theme throughout all these trials by combat, or trials by ordeals, including this one, is the victor was chosen by God. It's not whoever's the better fighter, obviously. It's based on who God chooses as the victor. Some changes, the name changes to the courts, as in to assert dominance and alienate Saxon culture. The punishments handed down by the courts were also much more brutal. So the 100 Court now became the Manor Court. The Shire Court became the County Court. The Royal Court remains the Royal Court, except now William of Normandy was in charge. So in terms of courts, you see a change of names to remove the Anglo-Saxon influence, and the punishments being handed down in courts were much more brutal and harsh. The reason for that being, as said earlier, William needs to assert dominance over a rebellious Anglo-Saxon population.